Welcome EPG Pathshala. I am Hemlata Nagarajan, Professor at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. In this unit, we will present Neurolinguistics. The module that we are dealing with is the neural basis of language, which is part of the paper Introduction to Linguistics. Neurolinguistics is a branch of linguistics. In this module, we will deal with what is neurolinguistics, why neurolinguistics, the history of neurolinguistics, the brain mechanisms involved when we speak a language or process a language, what happens when a language is lost, that is the different kinds of aphasias and dementia and the recovery patterns in bilinguals especially, how are words and sentences accessed when we speak a language, and finally we will look at recent studies in the area of neurolinguistics. First of all, to answer the question, what is neurolinguistics? We know that the brain is a very interesting, amazing organ. In fact, Ambrose Bierce, in his dictionary called the Devil's Dictionary, says that the brain is an apparatus with which we think that we think. Isn't that interesting? When a person speaks a language fluently, we say that he is a competent speaker of the language, that he knows the grammar of the language well. This deals with linguistic competence. When we look at how language is acquired, we are looking at linguistic performance, which is the branch of psycholinguistics. And when we say that only man has the ability to speak a language, we are referring to the biological foundations of language, which is neurolinguistics. Neuro means brain and linguistics means language. So it shows us how the brain permits us to use language. The next question is, why study neurolinguistics? Neurolinguistics is an area that is of interest to people from different fields. Computer scientists are interested in neurolinguistics so that they can develop their own computer model of the brain. Linguists are interested in neurolinguistics so that they can test the psychological reality of the theories that they propose. Psycholinguists are interested in linguistics so that language breakdown could throw light on the speech mechanisms involved. Finally, speech therapists are interested in neurolinguistics so that the different kinds of language breakdown tell them what kind of therapy that they need to think of for which would be appropriate for different kinds of breakdown. Now let us move on to the history of neurolinguistics. In the past, it was difficult to study the brain because we did not have mechanisms like the scans which we have now to study the brain. So most of the earlier studies were autopsy studies. The first theory that was proposed was a theory known as phrenology. Gall and Spurzheim believed in this theory. They said that there was a relation between the mental faculties and the size of the brain areas. They believed that there were different parts of the brain that dealt with different aspects. There was a particular part of the brain that dealt with moral abilities, particular part that dealt with spiritual faculties, and another for intellectual faculties. And the size of that portion determined how developed the faculty was. Later on, they realized that this theory was wrong. The two main approaches in neurolinguistics later on were the approaches called the Localists and the Holists. The Localists believed that there were specific areas in the brain that dealt with specific aspects of language. It started with Paul Broca's study of a patient who had problems in language production. He could just utter a word or a syllable, tan. When this patient died, study showed that there was a lesion in the frontal part of the brain which came to be known as Broca's area. So Broca believed that this area dealt with language production. Later on, another scientist, Carl Wernicke, found a patient who had no problems in language production but had problems in language comprehension. He was a fluent speaker of a language. However, what he spoke did not make sense, nor could he comprehend the language of others. So he realized that this person had a problem with language comprehension. Interestingly, when they studied the brain of this patient when he died, they found a lesion not in the frontal part of the brain but in the part close to the temporal lobe of the brain, which came to be known as Wernicke's area. So initially, there were two kinds of aphasias that were proposed, Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. Based on this theory, Lichtheim proposed 7 different aphasias. The main belief in this connectionist model was that there was different centers in the brain which dealt with different aspects of language. There could be a breakdown in any of the centers, or there could be a problem in the pathway leading to these centers, which could lead to different kinds of aphasias. So when we hear a word, the brain has to match it to the phonological form that it has been stored in the brain. Once it is matched, then the meaning has to be accessed. So there is a concept center which gives the concept or the meaning associated with a word. The same process happens in reverse when you produce a word. From the concept center, you need to get the phonological information for the word, and then you need to articulate the word. So this diagram shows you the different kinds of aphasias that are possible. You could have a lesion at the Broca's area called Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. The pathway between Broca's and Wernicke's could lead to what is known as conduction aphasia. Then you have transcortical motor aphasia, transcortical sensory aphasia, subcortical motor aphasia and subcortical sensory aphasia. To know more about these aphasia, please refer to your e-text. You will get more information there. Now, what were the problems with the connectionist model? The problems were the following. 1. The direction of information flow was not clear. 2. It led to a proliferation of centers, some of which did not have a biological foundation. And some of these predictions of aphasias were not actually borne out. That led to the development of the Holist model or the Holist approach. According to this approach, there are many language functions that are handled by various parts of the brain working together or working in tandem. Let's move on now to the brain mechanisms involved when you speak a language or when you try to understand or comprehend a language. We all know that the brain is made up of two halves, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere controls the right side of our body and the right hemisphere controls the left side of our body. It is also believed that language is in the left hemisphere. How do we know that the left hemisphere is dominant for language? 1. As I mentioned earlier, evidence comes from brain damage. When the left part of the brain is damaged, it leads to problems in using a language. The second piece of evidence comes from what is known as the VADA test, where sodium amytal is injected into either the left side or the right side of the body. If sodium amytal is injected into the left side of the body, which goes to the right hemisphere, the subject has no problems in using the language. However, if it is injected into the right side, which means it goes to the left hemisphere, the subject has problems in using language. The third piece of evidence comes from the dichotic listening technique, where a subject listens to two different words uttered in the left ear and in the right ear. Usually, what is uttered in the right ear is heard by the subject first and is uttered by the subject. This shows that it goes directly to the left hemisphere and therefore he is able to comprehend this first. The other kinds of tests which show that the left hemisphere is the dominant one for language comes from split brain patients and from imaging techniques like the CAT scan, PET scan, fMRI, ERP, etc. Now, does it mean that the right hemisphere has nothing to do with language? No. We know that the right hemisphere also has a role to play in using a language when we use a language. If there is a damage to the right hemisphere, tone and prosody is affected. The patient speaks in a monotone and he or she may be syntactically right but pragmatically wrong, which means he or she might violate any of the maxims proposed by Grice. One, either maxim of quality, which says speak what you think is true, maxim of quantity, which says just speak enough and not more, maxim of relevance, which says speak what is relevant, and maxim of manner, which says speak in a coherent, clear manner. So, a patient who has right brain damage would either speak too much or speak not in a relevant fashion or not in a coherent fashion. Now, the most interesting question in neurolinguistics is, what happens when a person is a bilingual or a multilingual, which means when a person uses more than one language? How does the brain deal with more than one language? Are these two languages kept in two watertight compartments, or is there interaction between the two languages? There was a theory that was proposed called the switch theory, which said that when you use one language, the other one is completely shut off or switched off. This, however, was disproved by the following facts. One, code switching tells us that it is wrong. I am sure all of you know this famous movie called Jab We Met, which is a classic example of code switching of Hindi and English. This tells us that one language cannot be shut off when you use another language, because code switching is very common in India. The second test that shows us that the switch theory is wrong is the Stroop test. In the Stroop test, subjects are shown different colors written in different colors. For instance, take a look at this picture. Here you find purple written in red, yellow written in blue, red written in green, etc. Subjects are initially asked to just name these colors. Usually, subjects have problems in naming these colors, or they take a little more time than usual in naming these colors. When you give it to bilinguals, there could be an intrusion of a word from another language, especially when you give it in the second language. This again shows that languages are not kept in watertight compartments. The next question that we need to ask is, How are words and sentences accessed? First of all, when you want to utter a word, you need to think of the concept. When you gather more and more information regarding the concept, that is when you gather phonological information, the way the word is pronounced, then when you gather morphological information, whether it is a complex word or a morphologically simple word, and when you get information about the syntax, that is the part of speech of the word, etc., then the word gets fired. That means when you gather more and more logogens or information about the word, it gets fired or it crosses the threshold, and that is when you utter the word. This is known as the activation threshold hypothesis. How is the meaning accessed? Do we access the meaning as a whole or as composite parts? To give you a simple example, when I say bird, do you think of a bird or do you think of the features of a bird? Related to this is a prototypical theory which says that for everything concept that you have, there is a prototype. So there is a hierarchy in which information is stored. For instance, if I were to ask you to think of a color, tell me which color comes foremost in your mind. If I ask you to think of a fruit, which is the one that is uppermost in your mind? If you say red, for instance, or apple, for instance, as a fruit, it means that, and if most people say that, that is a prototype for a fruit or a color. Now, what about morphological information? Are morphologically complex forms decomposed? That is, if you have a word like examination, is it divided into examine and ation? Or if you have a word like cuts, is it divided into cut and serve? Or is it accessed as a whole, as a full word? The decomposition model says yes, the affixes are stripped, whereas a hybrid model, it says it is not so. Now, phonological information, how is it stored in the brain? We get evidence for this from the tip of the tongue state, slips of the tongue, or malapropisms. There was a teacher who once said to her students, "You have tasted a whole worm," and the students didn't know what she was referring to. What she wanted to say was, "You have wasted a whole term." What she had done was she had just changed the position of the two sounds ter and were in her speech. So it tells us that sounds are stored as phonemes, as distinctive features, or as syllables. What about syntactic information? When you come across a sentence, what the syntactic parser does is it tries to create a tree diagram, which you have learnt in your module on syntax. Here again there are two theories which say, one is the minimal attachment principle, which says do not have too many nodes. The second one, late closure, says that new items are added to the phrase or clause being processed so that it is grammatical. Now we have come to the last section of this unit, which is on recent approaches to the study of the brain or language processing in the brain. You all know that we have made a lot of advancement in technology. Now we have a number of mechanisms to study the brain. Some of them are the CAT scan, the PET scan, fMRI, MRI, and the most recent studies use what is known as the event-related brain potentials, or ERPs, to study the response of the brain to any stimuli. I am sure you would be interested in knowing how the brain is studied. When you do an ERP, these ERPs or event related brain potentials can be reliably measured using EEGs. EEG is a procedure that measures electrical activity in the brain over time using electrodes which are placed on the scalp. Now, what are the electrical impulses like? When you look at an ERP, you find a series of positive and negative voltage deflections as shown in this diagram. In this diagram, the N refers to the negative voltage deflection and P refers to the positive voltage deflection over time. There have been a number of studies using the ERP in recent times. For instance, studies have shown that ERPs for a closed class of verbs is different from what you get for an open class of words. Words, as you know, can be divided into two classes. The open class, which is an open set like nouns, verbs, adjectives and adverbs. You can keep adding to the list that we have, and therefore it forms an open class. And you have a closed class of words which are also known as function words or grammatical words, which is a closed class in a language. These are words like articles, prepositions, pronouns, conjunctions, etc. The ERP for a closed class is different from an ERP which you find for an open class of words. Another study showed that if you gave subjects a passage to read with semantically anomalous and grammatically incorrect sentences or words, they found that the ERP for the semantically anomalous ones was different from that for grammatical inaccuracy. So these are interesting studies that have been done in recent areas. You can refer to the articles that have been given at the end of your module in the reference section. We also have provided some study material. Apart from the references, you have some study material which is questions that you need to answer just to gauge how much you have understood the module. If you have any problems, you can write to us. We welcome any feedback from you. Just to sum up, again, this module dealt with neurolinguistics, a branch of linguistics that deals with how the brain processes language. It dealt with the brain mechanisms involved when you speak a language or comprehend a language. It dealt with which part of the brain deals with language. It dealt with the history of neurolinguistics, a brief study of what was done in the past and recent studies, and it also dealt with how words and sentences are accessed by the brain. Thank you and wish you good luck.